In every instance, there's an alternative to what has been going on. Why don't we take that alternative?
It simply can't be true of us that we're predisposed to war.
With all of the kind of time that's passed, with all of the energy, with all of the human ingenuity, so little has changed.
An artist is basically on the front line, fighting negative forces and trying to create a better world.
It raises a consciousness which says, I know you saw that. Now what?
Although a painting will never stop a bullet, a painting can stop a bullet from being fired. It can influence people to think differently about their world.
Bill Kelly is an unusual sort of artist, that he wants to make art that will enhance the process of the betterment of humanity. And he's also committed to this idea of an activist position as an artist.
One of the things that art can do is express this idea that we can be better than we are. That's the sort of idea that has found its way into my work and certainly to the big picture. A couple of years ago, I got a fellowship at the State Library here in Victoria, and I thought it would be really lovely to be able to do a project in this space that addressed the peace that some of us are able to live generally and the war and violence which others are suffering, with the aspirations that we will be able to bring a bit more harmony into the world. What I wanted to do was to use a collage of drawings to tell the story. And I decided to call it Peace or War, the big picture. For easy 12 months, I kept either drawing new images or taking historical images, which are a part of the catalog of images that I use, and refining them or redrawing them, seeing how they would fit within this larger context. One of the first images I wanted to include in the big picture was that of the mother and the child. It started with the idea of building a constructive, positive, bright society. This is the neighborhood that I grew up in until I was in my teenage years. I had a rather heroic mother, a wonderful older sister, and a wonderful younger sister, but we were all in a very difficult situation. Jobs were tough. Food was extremely scarce. Food stayed scarce for us for about 15 years, but it was extremely scarce generally at that time. I applied to the Bethlehem Steel, and I got employed as a laborer. I worked 5-6 days a week, holidays, any overtime I could in order to save money to go back to art school. During coffee breaks, during lunch, I always kept some sort of a sketchbook or a notebook or pads or something, and I did drawings. At times when there was the pours of metal and ingots, and you get this incredible strong light, white and black stuff, and very dramatic, which suited the kind of work that I was doing at the time, and still relates to what I'm doing today. The central image in the big picture is the destroyed street. I've collaborated and worked with a number of artists who've experienced urban conflict in a variety of places, including the Basque Country in Spain, South Africa, and Northern Ireland.
Well, for us in Belfast at the time, it was a war zone. There were British soldiers everywhere. There were army checkpoints. There were helicopters in the air. There were fortified barracks with sandbags and barbed wire and armoured cars. I mean, you put soldiers in a civilian conflict zone, they're not really peacemakers. Soldiers are there to fight a war. We responded the way young people do in any other country in the world. So I got involved in the IRA. And as a member of the IRA, we were involved in some military actions against the British, as we seen it. So I was eventually captured, caught, whatever you want to call it, and imprisoned for 12 years.
In a post-conflict society, art is very, very important. I grew up during the Troubles. I think it was probably inevitable for me to make work that was about what was going on around me. I began to work in community projects that I set up myself because I found too many of the community projects I was being asked to do were really about confirming the boundaries. But I think as an artist, you really have to kind of challenge those boundaries and lead people.
During the blanket protest, by law, the only thing at certain times that they had to have in the cell was a piss pot and a Bible. So we actually stood on the Bible to get off the cold floor. And, you know, I remember at the time thinking that, what an image. The idea that there was 40 other people up and down the wing standing on Bibles. People who stand securely on their beliefs, the Bible being like a kind of a totemic symbol of belief systems, and they won't step off it because they think everything else is uncomfortable or undesirable or cold. So by just maintaining your closed belief system, you actually put yourself in prison, in a prison where you don't have bars, because you don't need bars because they exist in your head.
This year I was invited into IFA, Ireland's biennale of sorts. So they chose some paintings from the late 90s. And I stood in front of those paintings and I could have wept because the images were overtly political. There was a huge divide in the centre. It was about the peace line in Belfast, massive kind of detailed crowds on either side. And I looked and I realised that with all of the kind of time that's passed, with all of the energy, with all of the human ingenuity, so little has changed. So, in fact, you could look at those paintings and think nothing has changed.
When I was working on the big picture, I had this thing in my mind about these places which had been destroyed. So I needed to create a space that was not a destroyed space, but a space that could set the stage, metaphorically speaking, for all that followed. And so constructing a streetscape intact up above that had some simple human activities in it was the creation of a context which was then going to be destroyed by the idiocy of war. So that streetscape gets repeated 3 times in the big picture. The bombing in the First World War, where you have the biplanes, and then with the Second World War bomber planes, and then below is that same street again, but now we have the stealth bombers. And the idea that we just keep repeating it over and over again.
The major problem is that the very idea of war is institutionalized in our societies. So much of our industry and science is devoted to the production of the materials of war that we just take it for granted. We romanticize war as well. You know, film after film is all about heroic actions. So it makes it seem as though it's a natural part of the very fabric of our societies and our experience of the world.
War, conflict and violence have been an abiding theme over the last sort of 25, 30 years in my work. People often say, what is the point as, war artists, for instance. There is so much alternative coverage through the media, but there is a different agenda. Journalists obviously have their job to do, which is to report, albeit, you could question how unbiased that is, but looking at the same event as an artist, you don't have that pressure. It's something more considered, more distant, more reflective.
Well, I think that I had spent a lot of my life being philosophically against the war, and any war, and thinking that my pacifism kind of let me off the hook in some way, that because I was intellectually against the wars my country was fighting, I didn't have to feel as bad about the fact that we were fighting them, and I didn't have to do much because I was already opposed to them. But that changed for me when I had a soldier in my classroom who went to war to get money to go to college, and he was actually a soldier who was stationed at Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq and was a prison guard there. And talking with him and knowing that he had gone to war, was willing to die and to kill other people in order to get money to go to college and to sit in my classroom, really highlighted my complicity in a new way. And I thought, oh, there's no innocent place to stand. I have to act and use my life as an instrument for peace in concrete, realizable ways. And not just have ideas about something that I think is wrong.
That sort of binary, the enemy is the enemy, we're fighting for good, they are the evil ones. The enemy, of course, they're fighting for their good. I mean, these things are never that simple, and in the end, we are all human beings. We all respond pretty much the same. We all have emotions, we all love, we all, hate, perhaps. It's easy to make demons, and making demons helps in the cause for rousing people to hostility. And anything that serves to subvert that, I think, is probably a good thing.
If you look at the image of the Abu Ghraib figure, it's effectively a silhouette. It's just effectively like a black cutout, but it tells so much.
And when that image came out, it kind of stopped everything for me. It was as if the world stopped, and I was like, what is going on in this image? How am I going to make sense of it? And then I noticed that public commentators were calling it a crucifixion image. And I wanted to understand how that narrative of salvific violence, the idea that Jesus was tortured and killed on the cross to somehow save the rest of us, what was that narrative doing when imposed on the bodies of Muslim men? Would it make people oppose torture? Or would it make them think torture was divinely sanctioned or ordained by God? So I began to investigate that image and trying to understand whether these images that were taken to celebrate torture might be used to oppose the kind of violence that was documented by those photographs.
In most of my work, I tried to relate to images that people already know the stories. So I'm not telling anything new to anybody. I'm just looking at it from my perspective and saying it is about our culture and that we are all contributors to this happening.
I was a child during the Holocaust, 9 to 15, and all my reactions and focus and perceptions were that of a child. I was not capable of insights. I couldn't see the big picture. I just tried to deal with that which was in front of me every day. The thoughts and reflections which I now have to share with others came after liberation and growing up.
I know people, survivors from the camps of Auschwitz, people who are survivors from Hiroshima, people who are survivors from the bombing of Guernica, some of whom are close friends of mine. And the thing that they say most is that they lost their childhood.
Just try to imagine 6 years without a book or music or a pleasant picture or view. No beauty at all, and plenty of the opposite. Ugliness, dirt, and stench. I believe it has a brutalizing effect.
I'd been drawn to some images of the Shoah where concentration camps were that refused to show any bodies, and all you can see is the bare absence of anything. And it's kind of these images that refuse to participate in dehumanization, refuse to offer a narrative of hope or that anything is different or fixed or mourned correctly. And there's something powerful to me about those kinds of images to make visible what's missing and leave questions in the viewer's head and offer discomfort or disorientation. To me, those kinds of images are more surprising and challenging than the ones that we are used to seeing that we might have absorbed into a narrative of horror that makes us not as uncomfortable as it should.
I remember after liberation, I detoured on my way to school into a street which had a second-hand junk shop. Everything was second-hand for a while, and there was a picture. It was some scenery. I thought it was so beautiful. I stood there and admired it. Such was the hunger for beauty. I can now tell you that it was the absolute kitsch, but like a very starved person that pounces on a stale bit of bread and thinks it's marvelous. That brought me to realize how deep is the need, part of being human, I think, to have aesthetic experiences. We take them for granted.
If somebody said the fact of art, the fact that it's in our world, that people make it, that we enjoy encountering it, that we can be moved by it and educated by it, that sometimes we can be disturbed by it, that it can wake us up sometimes. All these different aspects of it feed into the very possibility of human progress. And from that point of view, I think it almost definitely makes the world a better place just by being there.
This remarkable photograph by Nick Ott, the then very young Vietnamese photographer working for Associated Press, of the young Kim Phuc running down the road having been napalmed by American forces, coincidentally.
I can hear the airplane coming. Then I put my long lens and I saw the airplane. Then with a focus and saw the bomb coming down.
Right, okay.
First I dive and dropped 2 bombs. I said, oh my God, more people in the village. Then I had my leg, I had a viewfinder. I looked at my viewfinder. I looked for right pagoda. I saw Kim with her arm running with no clothes. I said, why is she wearing clothes? Then I run right away in a hurry. I take more picture of her. When I took a picture of her, I saw her arm burning, smoke come out, her body, a lot of smoke, and she skin keep coming off. I know she be die minute. Me and a friend of my BBC cameraman, we put the water, try to help her. Then I yelled in my drive faster, faster. From there to the Gucci hospital. When I'm there, I open the door, I jump inside the hospital right away. And I call the nurse, Vietnamese nurse, doctor, please help all the children, you know, I think they died. I picked on one girl, she died at camp. And they keep telling me, sorry, you have to take all the children Saigon hospital, the children hospital in Saigon. I have my media pass, I say I'm media. I work for Associated Press. They died, my picture front page, every newspaper in the world. They hear that, then they go out, bring Kim inside right away, and all the children follow her.
That picture went around the world and really helped to change people's perspective on the war. And many people, including me, attribute the notion that is one of the images that did help to stop the Vietnam War. And that helped lead me to the notion that a work of art can stop a bullet from being fired. And so I include it in exhibitions in that, and sometimes people scratch their head.
Our society looks at a particular image in a photograph, and this becomes an iconic image that artists use, whether that was the intent of the photographer or not. For me, that's profoundly irrelevant. It's really a question of what we do with it.
The worst enemy of any artist is sentiment. It's not about sentiment. It's a flash of light on the truth. And it's not always pleasant, and very often we have to turn away. We say, oh my God, the little girl running towards us had just been napalmed. The naked truth of that. It raises a consciousness in a deeply personal way, which says, I know you saw that. Now what?
I wanted to include the names of people whose work had influenced me or who had spoken in terms of human rights or peace. It seemed that they really needed to be the foundation of the work. And for me, they've often been a foundation in a sense. And not all of them are terribly famous, the names on this, but they're all people who have had some influence on my thinking or their work has.
The only regret about having been arrested for social justice as many times as I was is that I didn't start earlier and that I wasn't arrested more, because it had the most profound effect. I mean, I was in New York for the entire 60s, so I was involved in the civil rights protests and in the anti-war movement. There were so many examples of actors specifically that have spoken out against social justice war. And they have been criticized by the media, by a lot of their fellow actors, and generally by the political norms of the time that, well, you're just an actor. What do you know about what's going on? Mind your own damn business. But as we well know, you don't have to be a genius to have a public life, you know, and get paid for it, or get voted to it. And these days, the bar has been practically non-existent.
Somewhere in the mid-60s, maybe 66, 67, I worked on a mural with a mentor of mine named Paul Keene. Paul was an African-American artist who was a teacher at the Philadelphia College of Art. The work with Paul, and mind you, there's very little of my hand that still shows. He painted over everything I did, I'm sure. It was the first work which actually probably did deal with direct social issues. And during this time, while I was working with Paul, there were riots which were occurring, very severe riots. And for me, the idea of how we should be able to live better together than we do is a seed that was planted at that time. Most of the larger works that I do, I include an image of the Aboriginal flag, not because I believe in nationhood per se, but because for the Indigenous community, it does give a sense of identity, and for the non-Indigenous community here in Australia, it gives us a sense of recognition of the solidarity that they have in relationship to their social aims and aspirations.
There has been Indigenous activism, if you like, ever since colonisation began. Indigenous artists have made art about, let's just call it invasion or colonialism right from the beginning, you'll find.
In the National Gallery in Canberra, we have the memorial, which stood for 200 years of genocide suffered by Indigenous people at the hands of European colonisers. Now, I think it's a great work of art, but what's very significant is that is at the gallery and not at the War Memorial. And in some ways I feel it should be at the War Memorial because it is a statement about a war that has engulfed Australia for a very long time.
Artists for Human Rights decided to do an international project to do with the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They invited me to be in the folio, being from Australia. I felt a little uncomfortable being a white fellow speaking on behalf of human rights in Australia, which has not had always the best human rights record, certainly related to our Indigenous populations. That was just carried over.
Yep.
I contacted Benjamin McEwen, who's from the Wirangu language group in South Australia. And Ben said, yes, he'd be happy to collaborate. So we worked on a woodblock together.
The print's jam-packed with iconography and metaphors and imagery that evokes what it is to be, you know, Indigenous in Australia. From the movement or the freedom of movement to confinement to freedom in general, motherhood, deaths in custody, and other things that are not only an Indigenous issue or an Aboriginal issue, but a human rights issue generally. I think my art has the ability to get people to think about Indigenous issues, human rights issues, cultural issues, subcultural issues, what it is to be cultural, what it is to be Australian, what it is to have your voice heard. Anyone's work, if it stops and makes you think, is a good thing. And the more people see it, the better.
About halfway down the big picture, there's a drawing of a mushroom cloud. That image is one which we're all too familiar with because it looms as something which actually happened, but it also looms as this imminent threat.
We launched the exhibition on the 60th anniversary of the first Merlinga test in September 2016. Of course, that wasn't the first atomic test in Australia, but it seemed to be a good date to remind people of the history. At the core of the exhibition, of course, there's the Indigenous experience and the Indigenous response to that experience.
Nuclear testing happened in Australia, and it's interesting to me how many young people aren't really aware of that fact.
There was an old man that was employed by the government to go around and warn people not to go south of the tribal area, but as we know now, the scientists made a miscalculation on the wind, and the fallout was carried 147 kilometres to the homeland where my people were living.
There's an element of radioactive racism there that's very disturbing and strong. Aboriginal families were discovered living in bomb craters, were discovered roaming in areas where nuclear weapons had been exploded with no idea of what was going on. The whole community at Wallatina on the APY lands in northern South Australia was covered by this sort of silent, oily, black cloud.
They called that the Buyumurru. Some of the old people died instantly. Others had burns from radiation, and others were spewing up. Dad lost one eye straight away. And yeah, people were very sick.
Ignition. So the average size of nuclear weapon in the global arsenal now is around 200 kilotons, so about 13 times the Hiroshima bomb. And there are still bombs in the arsenals that are up to 5 million tons of TNT equivalent.
高度経済成長をしていく上で、すごくパワーを持ったアーティストで、高度経済成長前のアーティストとしてパワーを持ってたアーティストで、その時丹下健三の建築の上にアートを作るぐらいのパワーがあった。
あと東京が中心になっていくということで、建築家があまりにも力を持ちすぎてアートが埋没していった。やっぱこれからは、もう一回アートが日本では復活すべき、力を復活すべきだと思っている。
In terms of influencing the general public, I think animation has maybe played a very strong role.
Look, a parachute!
In the sense of scenes of the actual bomb hitting people and very extreme depictions of what the bomb does to the human body in an animated form, but a lot of people have that seared into their memories there. A lot of that pushback towards the current Prime Minister's move towards changing the constitution so that Japan can fight a war and have a regular military is because of those decades of anti-war literature and film and media that have really ingrained in people that war is not something that Japan should be participating in ever again.
私は今でも夕焼けを見ると広島の8月6日に本当にごめんなさいごめんなさいたくさんの生きた人をね私は置いて逃げてるから夕焼けを見ると本当に苦しくなって逃げたい夕焼けが大嫌いですだから私はもうどこの国であろうと本当に言葉の世界平和じゃなくって仲良くすることをみんなに話してます。
The whole notion of the nuclear bomb was one which has destroyed this city, but has also brought about a very strong world peace movement, especially now with the voices of the children in the background and the activity, that sense of optimism and possibility. In 1963, I came across Guernica, and it had a very strong effect on me. This was a particularly moving picture which did focus on the plight of victims. It references an actual event at an actual place called Guernica in Spain, and that it was a bombing of a civilian population as opposed to other combatants. I found particularly distressing. And as I continue to find today, as in the big picture, where I list a series of names of places where civilian populations continue to be bombed. And you just think war is bad enough, but to do this to civilians has an extra level of tragedy to it.
The role of art nowadays I see really important. If something terrible happens with a war, or Picasso's Guernica, or some elements of the Picasso's Guernica are used in many artistic ways. It's an artwork that is old, but is new.
The painting has had such an impact that people have used it to try to stop bullets. They have used it to call attention to death and destruction. They have used it to influence policymakers to help stop things like the Vietnam War.
I read a report that Colin Powell, when he was trying to make a case for going to war in Iraq, asked that the tapestry reproduction of that image in the UN be covered with the blue curtain. And I thought, well, there's a man who knows the power of images, that you can't make the case for war in front of a painting that is perhaps the most iconic painting against war. I also thought it was interesting because during that same period of time, he used an aerial photograph that he labeled with arrows and words to indicate that there was evidence of weapons of mass destruction. And of course, later we learned that image didn't show that at all, that the trucks that he said were decontamination vehicles were actually just fire trucks. But I thought that was a fascinating juxtaposition of using a photograph to argue for going to war while standing in front of a painting that is protesting war that you've asked to have covered.
When I was first invited to Guernica in the mid-1990s, I only knew of it as a place that had been bombed. I only knew of it from Picasso's painting. And when I got there, I realized that there was this community of people who said, we forgive, but we will never forget. And it has become a European city of peace. In 1987, there was a massacre on the streets of Melbourne where a young man took a number of guns and killed people and wounded people. The timestamp that's on the big picture refers to the first emergency call that went in as a result of the massacres on Hoddle Street.
Melbourne police have charged a 19-year-old former Duntroon cadet with the murder of one of the 6 people gunned down on the streets of Clifton Hill last night. Another 18 people were injured in the shooting spree, which lasted about 40 minutes.
I became aware of how it was possible for an individual to so much upset an entire culture, a few million people, just one person. And people locked their doors, they got scared, they were frightened. There were articles about increased crime, none of which were actually true, but people were frightened.
Everyone's pretty upset, everyone, you know what? Well, if everyone's just in a bad mood.
I initiated what I called the Peace Project to create some artworks which dealt with this theme. And it wasn't the violence which I was interested in, it was the community. The perpetrator is never mentioned in the entire project anyway, in any form. And I did this night sky, which has a street lamp in it and some wires and the Southern Cross and this blue field behind it, which became a really gentle and evocative image. Nothing to do with violence at all, but with, in a sense, the view that some of the people who were victims would have had, the last view that they would have had on that night. The fact that that body of work, which was first exhibited in 1993, continues to be reproduced, continues to travel, continues to be referred to, continues to be a part of the lives of various communities and individuals, suggests that it has continued to influence.
I wanted to represent specifically mass shootings in America, but what I ended up finding that there's so much more to mass shootings than just what happened in schools. And I feel like I have to represent the lives of those that were lost as opposed to the perpetrator. Because I've noticed that in the media, every time a mass shooting happens, we only care about the person who did the mass shooting, but we never care about the victims.
It's all about the people who suffered the loss, but also about all of us, that if we don't speak up, it's our fault that these things happen. It's society's fault. And you guys know this, so I'm not telling you anything new. I'm just saying this is where I'm coming from. 9:37:50 p.m. was my moment. I guess Australia's moment, right? But this is yours.
Protect our children, not our guns!
Come up to me and tell me to my face that it was a terrible tragedy, I'm gonna happily ask him how much money he received from the National Rifle Association.
These guns
guns are sort of taking away the freedom of children in their school because they're so stuck up on whether they're gonna go to school and live or not. So, I mean, if taking away the freedom of having a gun is what we have to do, I guess that's the solution, so these kids can actually live.
One of the things that I think is interesting is to think about how images are going to work in the gun debate. I mean, we've had the Black Lives Matter movement that emerged out of video of police officers killing unarmed Black men, primarily, on camera. And those videos circulated, and it did nothing. Almost all of the officers were acquitted. And now we have students taking videos inside schools during school shootings. And there's the suggestion that maybe these videos will help us see gun violence differently and fight for gun control. I think it's a live question for me about what kind of violent images encourage people to resist violence and what kind of violent images show us lives that we didn't care about in the first place, and so they don't have that kind of effect.
One of the main things for me is that I want him to understand that art is not just necessarily a pretty picture that you're going to be putting up on a wall somewhere, because there are so many things that are happening in the world, and I want him to be able to use art kind of as a political weapon to bring awareness to and, you know, make change to these issues.
The image of the shadow of a hand which is coming across a person's lips is to do with the notion of how we are silenced, either physically directly, but also the inference of the shadow is that there are other forces at work that help to keep us from saying things, even if we observe them, and from calling things out. Part of the idea of art for me is that it provides a voice for people who may otherwise be voiceless. And a number of artists that I deal with share in this view. A particular one is Emmy O'Shaughnessy in Oxford, who works with youth.
Being removed from my birth mother, who was an extraordinary artist, it's a painful part of my past. But this place is extraordinary because it has made me, at different times, start talking more about my story and my history and not feeling like it has to be hidden. It's a big shift to take people who've been told that they don't have choices, that they are powerless, that they can't make change in their life for whatever reason, to then give them tools like a microphone or paintbrush and saying you can do anything. You know, that's frightening for people. So our job as facilitators of that is making people feel like it's possible, that their own creativity can be tapped into and then can lead them to make changes in their lives at their own pace.
Art is a constructive activity. Art's a building process, right? Building always takes longer than destroying, right? Always. To the very bottom of the picture, there's the construction of the bridge, which is the metaphor for peace building. And the idea that we have these people on these gantries doing these actions, literally silhouettes, which are on a very rickety sort of construct, right, which is what peacemaking is always about. The bridge building is an extremely important part of the whole thing because you need to acknowledge there's a gap. So the gap is not necessarily conflict. The gap is simply a gap. It's a space between these 2 points which needs to be negotiated if you're going to spend time together. And more often than not, we throw rocks across the gap, or there is no gap and we create a gap. And the bridge builders to say, they exist, we need to bring these sides together.
A Thousand Roses London began in response to the terrorist attack that happened in 2017 at London Bridge. There was a lot of hurt. This was the third such attack in a year, and we just decided to give out roses. to members of the public and create an alternative narrative to the fractious stories that were being reported in the media. The Muslim identity was kind of at the forefront of that story, as often is the case with terrorist attacks. And for me, that's always very unfortunate because the intention wasn't for the story to be about Muslims doing something good. The intention was to do an event that brought everyone together to break down that story of us and them.
The gift of the rose is a metaphor that I've used for a long, long time, this idea that you can only give something to somebody if they are willing to receive it. And so for the coming project, they will be putting a ribbon with a small tag coming off it that has a small drawing of mine and a poem.
There is both an intellectual and even more powerful and importantly an emotional dimension to the kind of thing that can happen to people when art teaches them to see a little bit differently or to feel differently about something.
One of the artworks which I always found very simple and very charming was a sculpture that was made by Robert Indiana, and it was called Love. The fact that it became a rather monumental sculpture that was made in multiples and ended up in various cities, I think has probably had a certain amount of a softening influence on a lot of urban environments. But I always felt just there are words which were not able to be used in art. And people have commented that about my work because I do use words like love and I do use words like compassion. I do speak about sensitivity. And those are considered soft words. It's not big bloke words, strong stuff, you know. Love is a powerful statement. I think generosity is a powerful statement. Kindness is a powerful statement. We tend to think powerful statements as being things which are overwhelming, in a sense. I tend to think of powerful statements as being ones which are such incredibly embracing of us as human beings. With great honor and pleasure, I would like to present the gift of peace, right, to the library.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This is a wonderful testimonial of today. And indeed, the gift of peace is so pertinent, not only to what we do, but also to where we are.
One of the people who I've collaborated with frequently is Rama, who's a performance poet, and Rama is also an academic.
My first job was with a huge humanitarian organization, advising them on how to relate to providing humanitarian aid in the midst of conflict. I was going from local communities affected by injustice to these highfalutin UN and African organization meetings where the decision makers, you know, would be. And I was thinking, this isn't working. We need film, or we need music, or we need art somehow to make our message clearer.
Rama's work as a performance poet deals with those people who have been disenfranchised in terms of conflict.
I am using an art form which is the enactment of testimonies of real-life human beings, from the grassroots activist to the so-called victim, survivor, unseen hero. So what happens is that as the UN people, as economic and political decision makers, see in front of their eyes a new witnessing of reality of the people they are supposed to be serving, something awakens in them, and what then happens is I take them into a process, which may be very short but could be prolonged, of how can they use these new awakened possibilities of having witnessed real lives through this artistic intervention to come up with new solutions to crisis. And what happens in that is you see that in a short time, people go back knowing what you know, that if my creative human self is awakened, if I'm always bringing heart and art into everything I do, I can stop bullets from being fired.
I'm really pleased about the results, but the stages all the way along have been really good. And then for me to be able to see it unrolled like this, in a sense, and to have it in place is terrific. It's 18 months to make this piece, and this is the first time I've actually seen it. In fact, that's the reality of it. That I've seen it in sections. I've seen it as it comes, sections out of the printer, all this, but it's the first time I've actually been able to look at it head on and see the whole thing at one time. And that's a pretty nice experience for me.
I think individual works of art can have a trigger effect. It can just shift enough perceptions for the ultimate destination to be very, very different from how things were moving in the first place.
After all, you know, culture is conversation with one another about how individual experiences are somehow crystallized into a work of art that other people can then relate to, and that is how it works.
The installation itself is creating a lot of discussion about the idea of peace and social justice and human rights and the relationship of artists as activists. So we will wait and see how big its life becomes. But it has been born, and it will move out into the world.
One-tone ties, hollow pledges, campaign lies. You drink champagne while justice dies, but you do not speak for me. You lock up children, steal their youth, stash your cash in polling booths. You sell your fiction, call it truth, but you do not speak for me. Hey, we gotta wise up, friends, we gotta rise up. People, lift your eyes up, see the trouble we are in. It's uphill town, but we're the people. Shout out loud and stand up strong to come together as a power to fix what we think